The Minnesota Wild just signed Brock Faber to a big contract extension. But how do we grade out their offseason? Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild joins us to discuss that and all things Wild next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Gil Martin here, and welcome everybody to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. With the playoffs in our rearview mirror, there just aren't as many games as we would like. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Wild and a familiar face to Locked On NHL viewers, Seth Toupal. And Seth, been a pretty busy couple of weeks for the Wild lately.
Yeah, it's amazing how much they've done with how little they've had access to. Like, we knew going into the offseason, it was going to be tricky to make a ton of big moves. We figured they maybe had enough room to lock in maybe one guy for sure. And we knew that there was going to be a big extension looming. And so it's like Bill Guerin just saw the checklist and was like, okay, check. And now we're just kind of hanging out until preseason gets going and we get a little better idea of who's in and who's out.
So the big extension, Brock Faber, were you surprised at the numbers, the term, the dollar amounts, and do you think it was a good deal for the Wild?
I surprisingly actually thought it was going to be a higher AAV than he ended up getting, which is crazy to say about an $8.5 million AAV deal. But the thing about Brock Faber that I think is most impressive is how quickly he takes to different things on the ice. He came in and he was already a good defenseman, but he added a lot to his offense over the course of the season. He never ran the power play with the Gophers. He did that with the Minnesota Wild. So he was learning on the fly, and he did a pretty darn good job of it. And not only that, but just the number of things that he was responsible for with the Minnesota Wild, having to be the number one defenseman for a good portion of the year due to injuries to Jared Spurgeon and Jonas Brodin, playing on the power play, playing on the penalty kill, being the key guy in late stage moments, in overtime, you name it. Brock Faber did it. He had a stretch of, I think, 4 or 5 straight games where he was 25 plus minutes a night, including a couple of 30-minute per night performances. He was 5th in the NHL in total time on ice. Oh, and he played the entire final 2 months of the season with broken ribs, and nobody knew about it until after the season was done. He didn't even mention it because to him, he was going to do whatever it took to be out there on the ice to help get his team in position for a potential playoff spot. And I shudder to think about where the Minnesota Wild would have been had he not come in and been able to be a calming, dependable presence on the back end. Oh, and then he nearly had a 50-point season, which would have been the second time it's been done by a Minnesota Wild defenseman. Ryan Suter's the only other one to do that. And so he accomplished all these different things as a rookie. And so you look at that 8-year deal, it's perfect because he's 21 years old. And so this will take up, the hope is with defensemen that in that 28, 29 year range is when you kind of start to hit your peak. And so he'll still be in his peak, assuming everything goes well with injuries throughout this contract. But if you look at where he's at right now, he's playing at about a $7.5 to $8 million per year defenseman right now. if he continues to improve and escalate, especially on the offensive end, then all of a sudden you're looking at a guy who is a double-digit AAV defenseman, no problem. And this ends up looking like a bargain. And this follows a pattern that the Minnesota Wild have done with the last few big extensions they've signed. Matt Boldy got that 7x7, and 1 year into that, he looks like that's going to be a huge bargain. Joel Eriksson signed an 8-year deal worth just over $5 million per season. He's a few years into that deal. That looks like a massive steal. And so the Wild like to do this. They like to sign the big deals early. And yeah, you may pay a little bit more on the front end, but the hope is that with all these, they end up being huge bargains at the end of the midway through to the end of the deal. And it doesn't look like that's going to be an issue with Brock Faber at all.
Talk to me about some of the other moves that were made. I know they're not as monumental as Faber, but still important.
Well, Bill Guerin identified the need to get back to the identity this offseason. And we had kind of thought, those that cover the Minnesota Wild had thought that, maybe you go and try to get somebody on the second line to help with the scoring. But Bill Guerin went out. He identified the identity and the penalty kill as two huge areas of concern. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong. After guys like Pat Maroon and Brandon Duhaime were traded last year, the Wild were pushed around quite a bit down the stretch. And so there was definitely a need to go get some punch, to go get some bite. You go get Yakov Trenin and sign him to a 4-year deal. Maybe a year too much for my tastes, but he does help with being physical and being just a bully out there on the ice. But he's also very good on the penalty kill. So he helps out there. And then you go get Jacob Loco from the Boston Bruins. And he's a young guy, but he hits like a maniac. And so Bill Guerin did help the identity. My only question about that is it feels like the Wild have a bunch of those types of guys. And if it were me, I would have hoped that those guys could supply more of the bite, more of the fight than they did over the last couple of seasons, as opposed to going out and getting another guy to add to that mix.
Right.
Trenin won't help because he will. It's just, I would have liked to have seen, that relied upon within based off the guys the Wild had. But beyond that, a ton of depth added to the organization, a bunch of two-way contracts. That was a key too, is the Wild just had no depth last year to handle injuries. And so now you've got some guys who have NHL experience that will most likely be down in Iowa. If you suffer an injury, need to make a call-up, they'll be near the top of the list, and they can at least come in and just kind of right the ship. But it's like when you're grocery shopping on a budget. You got your list, and it's like, hey, don't deviate from this list. Get specifically what we have written on here, and Bill Guerin did that.
So now that Bill Guerin has checked a lot of things off the list, what is your biggest concern? Here we are a month out roughly from the start of training camp.
Secondary scoring is the biggest thing for me, assuming that the Minnesota Wild keep the combination of Joel Eriksson, Matt Boldy, and Kirill Kaprizov, which was among, if not the best line combination in the entire NHL once they came together. If John Hines elects to keep that group intact to start the season, it's going to be on the second line, which will be Marco Rossi, Matt Zuccarello, and there's a big question mark in that wing spot on that second line. Will it be rookie Liam Ogren who handles that spot? That remains to be seen. Will it be Marcus Johansson, who, quite honestly, he did not perform as to what you would expect from a second line guy in that spot last season? Will he be given another opportunity there? That's going to be a really critical thing for the Wild to determine who gets that spot, because we saw it down the stretch last year against the teams above them in the playoff chase. If you can slow down Kaprizov, Boldy, and Eriksson enough, and that second line can't cut it, that's a pretty easy recipe to put the Minnesota Wild in the L column. So that second line wing spot is going to be really key. The other things that I'm really interested to see how they play out, considering the moves that were made, is what the special teams units look like. Who's going to be on that top power play? It's been pretty heavy in the past of Kaprizov, Zuccarello, Boldy, Eriksson, and probably Brock Faber or Jared Spurgeon. What does that penalty kill unit look like? Yakov Trennin's going to be in the mix. Do you put him and Joel Eriksson Ek on that top unit? And then, Spurgeon, Brodin. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And schematically, if we see any differences in that unit, because it was a sieve last year. They were operating most of the season at about 61%, and quite frankly, I'm surprised that they got it higher than that, because it seemed like every time another team went on the power play, it was just throw the puck in the net and be done with it. So that's going to be a real key for this team. If they want to get into the postseason this year, it's going to be secondary scoring and special teams that are going to massively decide if that happens or not.
All right. Well, I know you'll keep a pulse on this all season long and all year long. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Make sure to check out Locked On Wild on all your favorite social accounts. Now that we are in August and moving to closer to the 2024-2025 season, we're going to be bringing you more social media presence to kind of gear you up for what is to come this year. And you can, of course, also follow me on X at Seth, TOUPS, for all your favorite Minnesota sports takes, because let's be honest, Minnesota sports give me plenty to talk about in addition to the Minnesota Wild. So come out and have some fun. And most importantly, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Wild.
All right, Seth, thanks so much. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure, Gil.
Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked-on. Just go to Indeed.com/locked-on right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/locked-on. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed.